At 7:42 on a Tuesday evening, Nia Bennett looked up from a ledger that should not have existed and told Han Do-yun not to call anyone. He had entered the basement archive expecting routine paperwork, not find his temporary archivist, beside records showing warehouse leases owned by Hanyul Freight Holdings 12 years after the company supposedly disappeared. More troubling was a handwritten code, JH7, repeated across port leases, trust amendments, and property transfers from departments that should never have shared the same notation. Do-yun asked why she had not contacted legal, and Nia answered that if the code meant what she suspected, the first person they warned might be the person keeping it alive. Within a minute, the quietest room in his empire had become the only room he was no longer certain he controlled. Do-yun had built his reputation by deciding faster than other people could assemble objections, and most employees responded by becoming careful whenever he entered a room. Nia did not, partly because she disliked unnecessary fear, and partly because her work had taught her that powerful people often confused confidence with accuracy. When he demanded names of everyone with archive access, she refused until she knew whether the pattern was criminal, administrative, or simply an old structure nobody remembered. He reminded her that dormant entities and layered ownership were common in family companies, and she agreed before sliding him a Chicago warehouse acquisition carrying the same code as a Busan lease 11 years earlier. Coincidences usually do not own property, she said, and the sentence irritated him because it sounded less like speculation than an indictment of his corporate history. Nia was 34, black, plus size, 7 months pregnant, and officially hired for 6 months to reconcile records nobody important had wanted to read closely. She had learned that archives were not passive rooms. They were maps of what institutions remembered, what they buried, and which mistakes became traditions after everyone stopped naming them. Do-yun had quietly classified her work as administrative until now, and she had recognized the assumption in the way he asked for conclusions without asking how she reached them. When he asked how long she had suspected something was wrong, she admitted 3 days, although she had understood the possible scale only 20 minutes before he arrived. When he questioned why she stayed so late while pregnant, she told him that was a reasonable concern wrapped inside an unreasonable tone, then sat because her back had begun to ache. The humor almost softened him, but another folder connected the mysterious code to a family trust amended under his grandfather, through a nominee service Do-yun had never heard mentioned. Nia explained that somebody had maintained small ownership positions across 12 companies now embedded inside Han Meridian's logistics network. Never enough to attract attention alone, but enough to matter together. The danger was not immediate control of the parent company. It was influence over 3 subsidiaries that depended on old structures for land, warehousing, and voting rights modern management, treated as historical debris. If someone understood those connections better than current leadership, that person did not need to own Han Meridian to create a crisis inside it. Do-yun reached for his phone again, and Nia stopped him by saying security would turn uncertainty into panic before they understood what they were protecting. "Give me 48 hours, she said, asking for control over archive requests, permission to cross-reference restricted records, and enough freedom to test the pattern before frightened employees started changing stories. He told her she did not possess that authority, and she answered that authority was precisely what he would have to lend her if he wanted evidence instead of obedience. The request was audacious from a contractor whose badge would expire before the next quarter, yet Do-yun understood the logic almost immediately and placed his executive access card beside the ledger. He told her she had 48 hours, making it clear that if she was wrong, the lost time would belong to him rather than her. Nia picked up the card without thanking him, because gratitude would have made a corporate risk feel like a personal favor. She asked what he would do if she proved someone had hidden part of his family's empire for more than 2 decades, and he said he would find who benefited. "That is not the first question," she replied, closing the ledger carefully enough that its old spine did not crack beneath her hand. Do-yun asked what the first question should be, expecting another lesson about records, and for once, she gave him something colder. "You need to know whether they were hiding it from you or preserving it until the day they needed you to behave exactly as expected." He looked at the access card now in her hand and realized the next 48 hours would test whether the people closest to him were protecting his empire, preparing to take it, or quietly teaching him to destroy it himself. For the next 2 days, Nia treated the archive like a crime scene without ever calling it one, because theories were cheap and patterns became meaningful only after surviving repetition. By Thursday afternoon, the basement table had disappeared beneath port maps, lease renewals, trust documents, and timelines spanning 3 decades, while Do-yoon's unanswered calls from finance accumulated upstairs. Nia found that JH7 appeared whenever a cooperative called Jinhua Development entered an ownership chain, and Jinhua quietly held pieces of 12 companies now tied to Han Meridian's logistics network. No single stake looked threatening, but 3 subsidiaries could be influenced if the old agreements moved together, especially under a contingency mechanism preserved from his grandfather's restructuring era. Do-yoon wanted to call his uncle immediately when Nia found Han Song-min's name among the original trustees, but she told him the signature proved history, not intent. The first document that changed that distinction was a 1997 family memorandum, creating Jinhua as a continuity vehicle in case succession fractured the main company. At creation, the structure had been lawful and even sensible, designed to keep strategic assets from being scattered during a family or market crisis. 12 years later, however, an amendment granted extraordinary voting authority to whoever held the role of continuity custodian during a declared governance emergency. Nia spent an hour tracing renewals before placing the current designation in front of Do-yoon, and the signature dated 3 months earlier belonged to Seong-min. 3 months ago is not archival history, she said, watching anger sharpen his posture as the old mechanism stopped looking inherited and started looking active. Do-yoon's instinct was to summon lawyers, security, and Seong-min in that order, because action felt cleaner than uncertainty, and control had always been his preferred answer to fear. Nia asked whether he wanted to know why the mechanism had been renewed, or simply wanted everyone to know he had discovered it. The question annoyed him enough to be useful, and he finally let her expand the search into board minutes, debt covenants, and succession records usually kept beyond ordinary compliance review. Those files showed that 3 subsidiaries had changed their debt language during the same refinancing cycle, each adopting different ownership thresholds that could trigger lender scrutiny. The inconsistencies looked accidental until Nia aligned them with the exact subsidiaries covered by Jinhua's dormant voting rights. A second pattern emerged from board minutes, where Song-min had once proposed placing those subsidiaries under a family continuity committee, only to lose by 1 vote while Do-yoon's father was alive. Months after his father's death, the proposal returned, then disappeared before a second vote, which Do-yoon interpreted as proof that his uncle had eventually found another route to control. Nia refused the conclusion, arguing that leverage could be used for ambition, protection, or fear, and intelligent people usually carried motives that made sense to themselves. She showed him a risk memorandum from 8 months earlier describing Han Meridian's increasing exposure to short-term dollar debt during overseas expansion. The refinancing Do-yoon approved had reduced risk at headquarters while concentrating dependency inside the same subsidiaries Song-min could influence through Jinhua. That discovery struck closer than any hidden signature, because Do-yoon had chaired the finance meeting and remembered approving the consolidated figures without questioning how the risk had been distributed. He insisted the summaries had been technically accurate, and Nia agreed before telling him the more uncomfortable truth. Someone could mislead him without ever placing a false number on a page. "You trust people who have earned access to simplify complexity for you," she said, explaining that his weakness was not ignorance of detail, but confidence in the people choosing which details reached him. He asked whether that was criticism, and she told him it was diagnosis, then admitted her own weakness was almost the reverse, because documents felt safer than people. Before he could ask why, she turned back to the records and found a sealed governance file containing the original lender correspondence. Inside was a memorandum warning that the refinancing could expose those subsidiaries to coordinated voting pressure if market conditions deteriorated, written before Do-yoon approved the deal. Song-min had ordered the memorandum preserved, and the distribution list named the chief financial officer, outside counsel, Song-min, and Do-yoon himself. Do-yoon stared at his own name because he had never seen the document, then checked his calendar and briefing files as though memory might rescue him from what the paper implied. Nia did not tell him he had been deceived, because there was still another possibility, but she pointed out that somebody had wanted Song-min to believe the warning reached his nephew. For the first time, Do-yoon stopped asking whether his uncle planned to take his chair and began asking who benefited if both men made decisions from different versions of the truth. By Monday morning, Do-yoon had reviewed every calendar entry, briefing packet, and executive summary connected to the refinancing, yet nothing showed the warning memorandum ever crossing his desk. Nia found a digital routing record proving the document had entered executive administration, been marked for his office, then removed from the distribution queue 47 minutes later under a shared authorization code. He wanted information technology involved immediately, but she warned that 6 senior staff members had access to that code and an inquiry would alert whoever had redirected the file. Instead, she urged him to narrow the field and speak with Song-min before suspicion hardened into another decision someone else could exploit. This time, Do-yoon agreed without arguing, which told Nia the archive had already begun changing him in ways he did not yet understand. He met Song-min that evening at an old restaurant near Namsan, choosing a place their family had used before private dining rooms, and corporate security became part of every conversation. Song-min arrived early and answered the first question before Do-yoon could finish asking it, admitting he had renewed Jinhua because he believed his nephew ignored the refinancing warning and intended to strip legacy subsidiaries from family oversight. Do-yoon said he had never received the memorandum, and Song-min reacted not with surprise but offense, because the distribution list carried Do-yoon's name, and every later decision suggested he had chosen expansion anyway. Instead of dominating the room, Do-yoon forced himself to say something he would once have considered weakness. "I think somebody may have wanted you to believe I saw something I never received." Song-min studied him for a long moment, then reached into his briefcase and placed a document on the table. The proposal carried Han Meridian's executive planning format, Do-yoon's digital approval stamp, and a recommendation to sell 2 legacy subsidiaries while consolidating voting control under the parent company. Do-yoon recognized the language but not the decision, because he had considered pieces of such a restructuring without ever approving the plan in front of him. Song-min called that explanation convenient, and Do-yoon nearly returned the insult before noticing how perfectly the forged proposal mirrored the missing warning. One document told Song-min that Do-yoon intended to dismantle the old safeguards, while another told Do-yoon nothing at all about risks that might justify those safeguards. Someone had not merely hidden information. Someone had manufactured 2 believable realities and waited for powerful men to defend themselves against each other. When Do-yoon returned to headquarters near midnight, Nia was still working with her feet elevated on an empty archive box, an accommodation she clearly resented needing. She read his expression before he spoke and asked whether Song-min had been given something too, and he slid the forged strategy plan across the table. Nia compared its metadata with the real planning templates and confirmed what the signatures already suggested. Whoever created it understood internal formatting, approval habits, and the assumptions both men would make. "This is not a succession fight," she said, "because a person seeking one man's victory would not need both men equally misinformed. It was an isolation strategy, designed to make the people capable of stopping a crisis spend their attention distrusting one another instead." That realization changed the investigation from ownership to information, and Nia began listing people who had spent years moving documents between executives powerful enough to assume someone else had verified them. The first name was Park Yoon-ji, a longtime executive administrator who had worked under Do-yoon's father, Song-min, and eventually the chairman's office, giving her access without the appearance of authority. The disappeared warning had moved during a window when her credentials were active, while the forged restructuring document used a template stored in systems she could reach. Do-yoon asked whether Nia believed Eun-ji had manipulated the family for years, and she answered that access made her capable, not guilty. Then she found a second name in the debt summary requests, and the shape of the scheme changed again. Choi Min-jae was a risk analyst who had worked under the chief financial officer for 9 years, earned strong reviews, and been passed over twice for promotion. His father had lost a substantial portion of his pension after a legacy subsidiary restructuring approved by Do-yoon's father, and the appeal had later been denied by a committee chaired by Song-min. The motive was obvious enough to be dangerous, which was exactly why Nia refused to call it proof, even after she discovered language from Min-jae's internal templates copied into 3 supposedly independent debt requests. Do-yoon wanted him suspended immediately, but Nia proposed a narrower test. wrote a false internal notice saying Jinhua records would soon be moved outside the company, then watch who reacted. At 9:15 the next morning, an archive request for the original trustee files appeared under Min Jae's credentials, followed 13 minutes later by a call from his workstation to an advisory firm employing his younger brother. Do-yoon asked whether the call was enough to bring Min Jae downstairs, and Nia said it was enough to protect the company, but not enough to decide what kind of man he was. His system permissions were suspended quietly under compliance procedure, and an hour later he sat across from them in a small review room without lawyers, cameras, or the public humiliations several directors would later demand. The routing logs, template history, and archive request lay on the table between them, leaving little point in denial, yet Min Jae looked more tired than frightened. When Nia asked why he had created the forged strategy draft and manipulated the risk summaries, he gave Do-yoon a bitter stare and said his father had lost his retirement, while the Han family called the damage restructuring. "I wanted you to know what it feels like when somebody above you changes your life and never has to explain why," he said. Do-yoon could have answered with anger, because thousands of employees had been placed at risk by a private grievance, but Nia watched him choose restraint before speaking. He told Min Jae that what happened to his father deserved review, then refused to let that injustice become permission to endanger people who had never made the original decision. Min Jae admitted he had exploited the refinancing weaknesses, circulated the false proposal, and helped make Sungmin believe Do-yoon intended to strip legacy protections. He also admitted using Yoon-ji's ordinary routing process because she rarely questioned documents carrying proper authorization, which cleared her of intentional participation while exposing how easily routine trust had been weaponized. For the first time, Min Jae's certainty faltered when Do-yoon promised an investigation with counsel and refused to make him the public face of every failure Han Meridian needed to explain. The confession solved the sabotage Min Jae understood, but Nia returned to the archive instead of treating the case as closed, because one date still refused to fit. The private consortium interested in acquiring Han Meridian's logistics terminals had begun positioning itself 18 months before Min Jae altered the first document, long before his resentment became useful to anyone else. His younger brother's advisory firm explained how he learned buyers existed, but it did not explain why those buyers were already waiting for the exact assets most vulnerable to Jinhua and the refinancing covenants. Nia placed the consortium mandate beside the debt documents and told Do-yoon that Min Jae might have believed he was designing revenge while walking through a weakness somebody else had built in advance. Do-yoon looked at the distribution list from the missing memorandum and finally said the name he had avoided because trust made it expensive. Lee Jae-hyun, Han Meridian's chief financial officer. Lee had served the company for 17 years, designed the refinancing, defended its structure before the board, and recommended parts of the same advisory network later circling the distressed assets. Do-yoon resisted the conclusion because Lee had been one of the people whose summaries he trusted most, which made Nia's earlier criticism suddenly feel less philosophical and more costly. They searched the original banker drafts rather than approved agreements, and found handwritten changes repeatedly adjusting ownership thresholds toward percentages that would become dangerous if Jinhua's emergency rights were activated. The initials beside several changes were LJH, and although initials alone were not proof, they established that Lee had shaped the vulnerability before Min Jae began manufacturing conflict. Nia then found an old compensation disclosure that turned suspicion into motive. 18 months earlier, Lee had entered a deferred advisory arrangement through a consulting company registered to his adult daughter, with payment increasing substantially if certain logistics assets changed ownership. The arrangement had never been disclosed to Han Meridian's board, and its timing matched the consortium's early interest in the terminals almost exactly. Before Do-yoon could decide how to confront him, two lenders requested an emergency review of the 3 subsidiaries tied to Jinhua after receiving warnings about governance instability. The timing meant whoever had engineered the structure knew the internal investigation was closing in and had begun accelerating the financial pressure before Han Meridian could stabilize itself. Nia told Do-yoon that anger could wait, because within days the company might be forced into negotiations over assets whose weakness had been designed years earlier. The board froze Lee's financial authority that evening, disclosed the undisclosed consulting interest to outside counsel, and offered lenders an independent audit before any emergency review could proceed. Seung-min agreed to suspend Jinhwa's extraordinary voting rights during the investigation, but only after Do-yoon did something his uncle had not expected from the man who once treated responsibility as another word for command. He told the board that the refinancing had passed under his chairmanship, that incomplete information explained his failure but did not erase it, and that he had approved a structure he had not understood deeply enough. Nia watched several directors shift uncomfortably because accountability sounded more destabilizing to them than blame, yet the lenders postponed their review for 14 days after receiving the disclosure package. 14 days was not safety, but it was time, and for the first time the company possessed something more useful than control, a chance to decide what kind of institution deserved to survive. The next morning, Nia asked Do-yoon to bring Seung-min into the archive, not the boardroom, because she wanted both men sitting in the only room where neither received a larger chair. She arranged 3 stacks of records before them, profitable assets with clean operating histories, subsidiaries carrying dangerous debt structures, and a thinner pile containing pension appeals, employee grievances, warehouse closures, and land disputes the family preferred to call legacy matters. Seung-min objected that those records had nothing to do with the lender review, and Nia told him they had everything to do with why a man like Min Jae could spend 12 years persuading himself that destruction was justice. Do-yoon understood before his uncle did that Han Meridian could spend 14 days proving the chairman still controlled the company, or prove the company could examine the systems that had created its enemies. If lenders already know we have weaknesses, Nia said, pretending we do not have them only tells them we are too proud to fix them. Her proposal was expensive and politically dangerous. Independent oversight of Jinhwa, full disclosure of the refinancing failure, review of unresolved employee claims, and separation of strategic assets from arrangements nobody could explain without invoking family tradition. Seung-min warned that such a review might expose decisions made by both their fathers, including choices the family had spent decades protecting from public scrutiny. Do-yoon looked at the pension files, then said a name surviving only because nobody examined what it had done was not strength but fear, polished into reputation. The sentence did not make Seung-min agree immediately, but it removed the argument he had used for most of his life, because duty sounded different once silence became part of the cost. By the end of the meeting, he accepted independent oversight and surrendered his ability to activate Jinhwa alone. Over the next 10 days, Han Meridian became less polished and more credible, which unsettled executives accustomed to treating vulnerability as something competitors created rather than something records revealed. Lenders received documents before requesting them. Outside directors gained access to files previously reserved for family officers, and 2 questionable subsidiary structures were placed under voluntary review. Former employees with unresolved pension claims were contacted, including Min Jae's family, although the review remained separate from the consequences of his misconduct. Lee's undisclosed financial interests were confirmed by the independent audit, and Do-yoon chose to report the findings to lenders and regulators rather than bury them behind a confidential resignation. The decision cost the company money and embarrassed the family, but one by one, the major lenders withdrew their emergency review requests because the institution had begun behaving like something governable. On the 12th evening, Do-yoon found Nia outside the conference room with one hand pressed against her lower back, exhaustion finally defeating the pride that had carried her through 2 weeks of crisis. His first instinct was to order a car and a doctor, but he caught the command before it left his mouth and asked instead whether she wanted to go home or needed medical care. Nia noticed the correction, breathed through a tightening across her abdomen, and told him her doctor had warned that fatigue could trigger discomfort, but she would seek care if it continued. While they waited for the elevator, he told her she had saved the company, and she rejected the sentence with the same impatience she had shown toward praise from the beginning. "I showed you where the system was broken," she said. "You decided whether protecting your position mattered more than repairing it." Do-yoon offered her a permanent role as Director of Institutional Archives and Governance History, but this time he had already placed the position under the Governance Committee rather than beneath his personal authority. Nia asked whether he had designed that distance because he trusted her, and he answered that trusting one person was exactly why the structure should protect her ability to disagree with him. Then, more carefully than anything he had said in a boardroom, he admitted he had spent 2 weeks trying to decide whether what he felt around her was gratitude, dependence, admiration, or something that should remain unnamed while she worked for him. He told her he was asking for nothing and would not turn professional gratitude into pressure, but if their employment relationship ever changed, he would like a conversation that had nothing to do with debt covenants or family crises. Nia said she would decide about the job first, have her baby second, and only then consider whether he was less exhausting outside corporate governance. Her maternity leave began 3 weeks later without a ceremony, because Do-yoon had learned that gratitude became spectacle when powerful people insisted on displaying it. 2 days after she left, the governance committee sent the offer with flexible terms and no deadline, and the message came from its chair rather than from Do-yoon. When Nia noticed that restraint, she understood he was finally proving something without arranging to be seen proving it. At Han Meridian, reforms continued without her. Sung-min accepted independent oversight, and Min-jae remained accountable for his actions, without being turned into a convenient explanation for decades of institutional failure. Then, on a rainy Thursday night, Nia went into labor earlier than expected, and the company that had consumed their lives became smaller than the life arriving without permission from a board. Nia's first call that night went to her doctor, her second to a close friend in Chicago, and her third to Mrs. Park, who had offered transportation if labor began before her mother reached Seoul. Do-yoon did not hear until the following afternoon, when Mrs. Park mentioned that Nia had delivered a healthy baby girl and both mother and child were doing well. He stood beside a conference table with his phone in hand, then set it down without calling because concern did not create entitlement. 4 days later, Nia sent him a photograph showing only a tiny hand curled around one of her fingers, along with the message, "Her name is Nia Bennett, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, and completely unimpressed by corporate governance." He replied that Maya already possessed excellent judgment, and Nia laughed hard enough to wake the baby sleeping beside her. 2 months passed before they saw each other again, when Nia returned briefly to collect books from the archive and found Do-yoon near the lobby cafe after a lender meeting. He asked permission before approaching the stroller, and she teased him for becoming exhausting in a completely different way, but invited him to sit. For 20 minutes, they discussed nothing that could save an empire. Maya's refusal to sleep before midnight, Nia's mother visiting from Maryland, and Sung-min treating a new garden with the seriousness of a hostile acquisition. When she finally asked whether the permanent position still existed, Do-yoon said yes, but explained that its authority now belonged to the governance committee and would remain independent of his personal approval. Nia accepted 3 days a week for 6 months, with flexible hours and childcare arrangements chosen entirely by her, then reminded him that their other conversation remained postponed while she worked inside Han Meridian. For the next year, Do-yoon respected that boundary so consistently that Nia sometimes found his discipline more persuasive than any declaration could have been. He challenged her recommendations in committee, even voting against one proposal without making disagreement personal. Jinhua became a transparent continuity trust. Old pension disputes moved to outside review, and Sung-min surrendered the final unilateral powers he had once mistaken for duty. While cataloging her last box from the founder's private files, Nia found a handwritten letter stating that Jinhua had never been intended to preserve Han control forever, only to stop one frightened generation from destroying what another might still repair. When Do-yoon and Sung-min read it together, they understood the mechanism had outlived the fear that created it. At the end of that year, Nia resigned because the archive department could function without her, which Do-yoon called a deeply unpleasant definition of successful institution building. She planned an independent consultancy for family companies with complicated histories, and he offered neither funding nor office space, only asking whether Han Meridian could become a client after committee approval. 3 months after she left, he invited her to dinner, and she chose a small restaurant in Itaewon where nobody owed his family favors and no private room could turn intimacy into performance. There, Nia finally told him that Maya's father had disappeared from every difficult decision once pregnancy turned commitment from an idea into responsibility, leaving her suspicious of promises that cost nothing when spoken. Do-yoon did not defend himself against a wound he had not caused. He simply told her not to trust his words yet, and to watch what he did when disappointment, inconvenience, and refusal became part of ordinary life. So she watched him for more than a year, and the relationship that followed grew slowly enough to reveal whether affection survived when nobody needed rescuing. He arrived when invited, accepted when he was not, learned Maya's routines without trying to become necessary, and allowed her independence to remain real. When he eventually proposed, he did it in Nia's apartment after Maya had fallen asleep, with dishes drying beside the sink and no audience position to make refusal difficult. He told her that he had spent most of his life believing love meant becoming essential to someone, while she had taught him it might mean remaining chosen when the other person was free to leave. Nia made him wait 7 long seconds before saying yes, then told him his proposal still sounded slightly like a governance report. Their wedding was small by Han standards and large by Nia's, with Sungmin present, Mrs. Park crying openly, and Maya more interested in flower petals than family history. Years later, magazines would still simplify the story by claiming that a brilliant archivist had saved a powerful man's empire, a version Nia disliked because it erased the harder truth. She had found the records, but Do-yoon had chosen whether to let them change him. Songmin had chosen whether duty mattered more than control. Employees had finally been allowed to remain inside the company's history instead of being edited out of it. Han Meridian survived not because one secret ledger rescued everyone, but because truth became useful only after people stopped treating it as a weapon for proving someone else wrong. Whenever Do-yoon passed the basement archive where he first met Nia, he remembered that power had once meant controlling the room to him, while the life he eventually built depended on something far more difficult, becoming trustworthy enough that people could disagree, leave, return, and still choose to stay.